Well, hello friends out there in YouTube land. Robert Hamm here with Robert Hamm Photography. Today we are continuing our conversation about the MiNT TL70, this twin lens reflex camera, which is really absolutely awesome. And I've got one right here. I've been enjoying this camera. You guys may have been following my adventures with it over on Instagram. That's where you'll be able to see all of the images that I'm talking about today. And the videos here on YouTube kind of bring this thing to a full circle masterpiece. So before we go any further, let's just jump right into it. Today, we're talking about the 4 problems most people encounter with the TL70 and how to correct them. And I think what we're going to find out is that there's a little bit more user error than there is hardware error most of the time. However, like anything, you may be experiencing a genuine issue that these suggestions don't fix. And if that's the case, please contact MiNT directly. They got a great 2-year warranty on their product, and they're going to make you happy one way or the other. That's been my experience with them. Those are the great stories that I've heard in the past, and I know that they'll keep that going with you guys. So, in no particular order, let's get into it. Number 1, green banding. So, this is the deal. Sometimes you have an image that comes out with what looks like in the dark areas little green striations. Now, I have not produced this here, and it's very difficult to actually have a picture of one unless you take a picture of it right away, because this is a problem with developing, and it's actually not a problem at all once we understand film, specifically the Instax mini film or the Instax film in general. But in a short real quick understanding of what happens, there are rollers that eject when your image is coming out that the actual packages of developer go through. They have a particular tension, and those rollers pop the developer packages inside the memo area, and as it's going through, it spreads it equally across the actual development part, the gel, and then it deposits whatever resin is left over in the little area down here. That's why you have a little top puffy area. That's to pick up any additional unused developer. So what happens? Most of the time, this problem is actually seen on very dark, underexposed areas. So you're likely to encounter this problem more often in the evening, like shooting at nighttime. However, what you'll notice is the problem goes away by the morning. And this is because film itself has a particular development reciprocity. And that's what you're seeing. You're actually seeing the pressure marks left by the rollers as the film is developing. And when you're developing the film from such a dark exposure, generally at nighttime, you may see some discoloration at first. And this is because FUJIFILM's Instax Film reaches about 95% contrast and saturation within the first 5 minutes, and then it reaches about 100% of its development within the first 24 hours. And that's how long it takes for the actual emulsion to stabilize and be completely done developing. Of course, UV light can affect this and different things, especially over time, but that's what you're seeing. So this is another reason why you might start off with a problem that you think is an issue with the camera and these green bands, but then the next day it's gone away. There's no issue there. Let's remember, if you have a problem with the rollers, you're going to experience something else, ripping, tearing, and stippling of the actual image. As long as your image itself, both the front and the back, are smooth and it doesn't look like there's any jagged tears, and I'm not talking about the occasional streak that comes from actually being pushed out of the rollers. I'm talking about actually torn or ripped a little bit. That's when you're having a problem with the pressure plate rollers in there. Otherwise, you're good to go. So there we have problem number 1. Let's move on to problem number 2. Vignetting. I really like this one. This is something that most people just overlook because there's so much going on with the TL70. I'd like to remind you that in the card that you get with it, it says something very simple, very nicely right here. It talks about the aperture and how to set it, and it says that you should gently adjust the aperture, and it says adjust the aperture wheel until the number is centered. Turning beyond f-bokeh or f22 may damage the mechanism, and that's important. You see, the aperture is actually a rotating dial on the inside of the TL70 that has different die-cut apertures drilled into that rotating dial. So it's a rotary aperture. So when you switch the little aperture down here, when you rotate that, you're actually rotating the entire disc to select the aperture that you want. And that's great, right? We all can agree that that makes pretty good sense. Well, let's show you what happens. Set it to bulb, set it to f22, and then let's look through right there. We should see a relatively centered. Oh, I pushed the ejection button. we should see a relatively centered aperture, and it's not. But watch what happens when I wiggle it a little bit, and see how it's centered there? Now let's look at it again. Now I'm going to move to something like 5.8 or f8, and now I'm going to move all the way down to f22. Look at that, it's off center. I'm going to close it because I've got it on bulb. I'm opening it again. I haven't changed anything. It's still off center, but look what happens when we adjust it nicely and just kind of wiggle it. You see, the smaller the aperture, the smaller the hole that's trying to align with the lens, and the more difficult that task actually is, specifically for a rotary aperture. Could MiNT have designed a different kind of aperture mechanism? Sure. That would have incurred more research, more development, and more production costs, which meant that the unit would have been more expensive for us. Really, all we need to do is take a little bit of time and gently adjust the aperture like MiNT suggests. My pro tip for doing it is to adjust it to f22 or f16 and then just wiggle it back and forth without actually trying to change it. You just want to feel it center into its natural detent, and there you're going to get a nice issue. But because we now know that we can actually change the aperture's position, we actually have some creative control that we wouldn't have otherwise. If you want to shoot an image that has a vignette because of a particular creative look, now you know how to do it, and you know how to get the best effect. That was number 2. And the solution. Let's go on to number 3. I like this one as well. Inconsistent exposures. So here's the idea. This is what we're talking about. Let's say you're shooting in a relatively controlled lighting environment where we think it's normal, where there are things that all look the same, such as, let's say, taking pictures of your kids at a park or something, or shooting outdoors. When you actually take the picture, if you're experiencing different exposures based on images that were taken just a few moments apart, it seems like the camera has some kind of inconsistency going on with it. Well, through my testing, I have found that the camera is a it's a shadow weighted matrix metering system. The electronic eye is metering the entire scene, and it's weighting the exposure to the shadows. So, for example, if you're shooting a nice image on a bright day and you have your exposure nailed, let's say you're doing, I don't know, whatever your exposure is and it's working for you, and then you take another shot and this lighting conditions seem to you to not have changed and the exposure is different, something has to have changed. And here's what it is. Our eyes as humans can see way more exposure values and dynamic range than what the camera can see. Specifically, exposure values, the EV of a scene, and dynamic range, how much can be displayed, are two separate things. Exposure value, the EV, is generally how much actual detail can be rendered by the actual medium itself. The dynamic range is how much you can actually see when printed. In this case, the two are similar because you're using Instax and you're both viewing and taking it on Instax. Negatives work a little bit differently, but if you had a negative, you could change the dynamic range of the negative by choosing to process it differently. Same thing with digital. So in digital cameras, you've got a lot of leeway. Only thing is, with Instax Film, no, you only have about 10 EV worth of total range that you have from your lights to your darks, from your shadows to your highlights. Let's take that into consideration. Most outdoor scenes are going to have about 17 different values, EV, of exposure range in there. If you go outside and you start taking pictures with your camera, you're going to have about 15 to 17 different EV on any given day that's bright with the behind shadows. Because the Instax film already has a limited range, when we actually are able to see that image once it's developed, we will notice these changes in exposure much more readily than we would otherwise. So, here are some pro tips for you. If you're taking pictures of your family or your friends and you're looking and you're noticing the color tone, if it's nice and bright, even if it's very, very sunny out, we're talking about the warmth of the light. If the light is nice and warm, you know you've got a bright, warm light suitable for photos. If you click the image and by the time you're switching out your aunts and uncles and cousins to take another picture, the light has changed and now has a cooler tone, you probably need to apply some positive exposure compensation or choose another aperture based on your experience. That's because the color temperature of the light is going to help you determine whether or not you're going to get a similar exposure. And because the TL70 is actually going to meter for the shadows, because the shadow color has changed, it's going to change the exposure value of the system itself, and that's going to be seen in the image that you get. So, pro tip, use it wisely, do with it what you will, let me know if it helps you. Finally, last thing we're going to talk about is focus issues. Now, there are some of us that may actually have focus issues with the TL70. And that's because this is a product like anything else. it will have an error rate at some percentage, which we don't know what it is. Mine works absolutely fine. 99.5% of everybody out there that's going to be using the TL70 aren't going to have an issue. But if you are having an issue with focus, it can become something of a confirmation bias when you then go and look for an explanation for it online. If you're experiencing an issue and then you type in focus issue for the TL70 because you're not getting what you think is a sharp tack focus, and then you get a whole bunch of blog posts that talk about focus issues with the TL70, you have confirmed only that the TL70 has a focus issue. You haven't confirmed your issue, only that other people have had the same issue. And that's the confirmation bias. You're excluding everything else. So a better way to think about it is to look at what's actually happening. Let's talk about focus in the first place. There's a Fresnel lens in there. That's that little rippled lens on the 2.0 that gives us a nice flat lens that also focuses. That also magnifies. That's why it's so bright. Guess what? It can probably resolve, I don't have any formal testing, so it's a hypothesis, but it can probably resolve and magnify an image that you see there much better than the film can actually resolve that image when it's done developing. Remember, Instax can only resolve 12 lines per millimeter of resolution. You're probably seeing much more through your eyeballs right now. In fact, we know we are. If all you could see was 12 lines per resolution, that'd be a problem. And what that means is if you're focusing on something very, very close, you will probably see a sharper image in the viewfinder, especially if you've filled the frame with your subject, rather than you will actually see on the film. And that has to do with how the film can, first of all, display the image. Secondly, don't forget that the Fresnel lens is actually magnifying. If you'd like to test this out yourself, you can do it right now without wasting any film. Just look at the Fresnel lens and then move your eye around a little bit, and you'll notice that the image changes. You'll notice that in order to see the brightest viewpoint of that Fresnel lens, you actually have to be centered over top of it. And that's precisely the way the lens was designed, to center the light in order to get the magnification and amplify the brightness, which is why MiNT chose to go with this in the 2.0 design. Really great option there. Another thing that we've got is, if you do decide to go ahead and check this, many people will say, hey, you know what? I'm going to actually measure the focus distance using a meter stick. And they'll put the meter stick right here at the front of the lens. They'll run it out. They'll get a little bit of an angle. They'll take a picture and they'll say, I've set it to, let's say, 80 centimeters by 0.8, right? And I can see that it's not actually focused on 0.8. It's really focused on 0.75. This is confirming the fact that the focus is wrong. Well, I'm sorry, that would not confirm that the focus is wrong, because you cannot measure the focal length of a lens from the lens, the front element. You actually have to measure it from the focal plane where the image circle presents its image for focus. And if we did that, we'll find there's about 5 inches or 5 centimeters in between there. And now, if you were performing that test, you'd realize that if you included that 5 centimeters plus the fact that you ran out to 75 in its focus, you'd have the 80 centimeters like you set right there. So when we're talking about focus issues and things like that, we want to make sure that we aren't confirming our own bias. And that's important because there's a lot of heat out there. The internet is one of those places that can make a mountain out of a molehill. So if you feel like you're having an issue in any of these 4 areas that I talked about, the first thing to do is to contact MiNT and let them know. You may choose to do some research, but don't let that research about what other people have been experiencing as far as problems guide your determination of what's actually wrong with it. Instead, think about it, go about it systematically and scientifically, and determine what issue you're actually having. Remember, if you can't explain it, you don't understand it. So if you're having a hard time explaining what the actual issue is, probably need to determine what your issue is actually before you try to solve it. And that's very important. I'd like to go ahead and make one other thing. I'm not experiencing any of these issues with the camera. Most of these have to do with the film rather than the camera, and some of them have to do with technique, specifically focusing. Learning how to focus specifically with this twin lens reflex camera is a bit of a chore. You have to kind of get there to it. My son, who's 13, he's got 20/20 vision. When he looks in it and I then go look at the viewfinder after him, I see a very vast difference of focusing, and that's a big deal. One other thing I'm going to add, because it just popped into my mind, is that we're dealing with medium format film. So the depth of field is much different for this film than it would be for your DSLR. Many of us are using an APS-C size DSLR or maybe a full frame DSLR, and all of those are much different. The exposures, all of those are different because the actual sensor size, the area that's used to collect light, is much smaller than what you have when you're using an Instax mini film. And we want to sometimes think that maybe that there's something wrong inside of the camera when there are many, many, many other things that could actually be happening. One other bonus tip while I'm on the roll, and I hope I haven't gone too long right now, is that the lens itself, first of all, even if you had some, let's say you had some micro scratches on it, the same time of scratches you might get from carrying your cell phone in your pocket with some change, the ones that you have to use the lens, you have to hold up to the light and like shine a light to it in order to see those little micro scratches, even if you did ever get any of those on your lens, mine has none, it would not affect the image quality because the medium itself wouldn't be able to resolve such a small detail. Plus, when you're focusing at something like infinity or even close up with a 5.6, even a 22 on this camera, it would be such a small deviation in the lens that it would not be able to resolve on the film. That goes to say the same with film, old lenses, when you're buying lenses out there. You know, I don't have any problem or qualm buying lenses that have maybe some fungus around the sides if I can get them for $10 or $12, because the likelihood is I will never actually see that in the finished image. Of course, in this case, I'd be using a DSLR and be able to edit out any issue in Lightroom. But what I'm saying for you is this, that as you're using this camera as a tool, that even if you think that there's a particular issue with like the lens or if there's a particular issue with focusing, the likelihood is that the camera will still be able to produce a viable image for the medium that it has, and that whatever image or issue that you think you might be having may actually be more what we think is happening rather than what actually is happening. If you can confirm it, then you got something that you can talk about, and and MiNT will be more than happy to help you. Guys, I'm Robert Hamm with Robert Hamm Photography. I've been talking today about the 4 main issues and solutions with the MiNT TL70. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I want to thank you for watching and remind you that I will catch you on the flip side.